So how could we remove items from this list here? Well, we have our list item, which is repeated for every new goal. It's still a regular HTML element though, even though we're using v4 on it. And that means we can still add event listeners to it. For example, a click listener here to react to clicks on the list item. And now let's say when a list item is clicked, we want to remove that respective goal from the goals array. Now for that, of course, in our JavaScript code, we can add a method. Remove goal sounds like a name that makes sense. Now we definitely need some identifier of the goal we want to remove. And I would say since we have the index anyways, we can just use that. So here in this remove goal method, we could expect to get the index as an argument, and then use the splice method, which is also a built-in method in JavaScript, to splice this one element at this index. In case you don't know this method yet, this method used like this will find the element at this index and simply remove it from the goals array. So this remove goal method should remove a goal at this index. Now we just need to make sure we pass in that index. And how do we do that? Well, let's go back to HTML. Here on this click listener, on this list item, we want to point at remove goal. But we also want to ensure that the index is forwarded to that method. So for that, we can call it explicitly by adding parentheses, and we got the index here. And both goal and index can only be used inside of this element which has v4 on it. So that means between the opening and closing tags in any child elements, but also, and that is what helps us here, on the element itself. So we can simply forward index, which is the index we're retrieving with v4, to remove goal. And that will be the index 0, 1, and so on of the goal on which we clicked. So if I reformat that and save that and reload, we can add finish the course and master Vue and learn all about Vue. And if I now click on master Vue, you see that this appears. And we only have 2 elements. And we can do that with all the elements until they're all gone. And then, thanks to vif, we see our paragraph again. So that is how we could remove items by leveraging this index and by connecting it with a click listener to a method that updates the array. And since we told Vue to output this array with v4, it has this built-in reactivity, which by now you can certainly tell Vue is all about, that automatically goes to the page and updates the list whenever the array changes. It adds more items if we added more items to the array, and it updates the list to remove DOM elements if we removed items from the array. That is all Vue does behind the scenes. And again, I'm really saying that a lot, I know, but that is why Vue is great. That is so much work we don't have to do in JavaScript. I mean, look how simple our JavaScript code is. It's barely any code at all. And yet we got a full dynamic list to which we can add items and from where we can remove items. And writing that with just vanilla JavaScript in the same efficient way without re-rendering the whole list all the time, that would definitely be a bit more difficult. We're almost done with vif and v4, but here's one important addition related to v4, which you have to be aware of since, well, you can see strange bugs if you're not aware of it. Let's say our goal and index here is actually in a paragraph inside of that list item. So it looks like this. Hence, if I master Vue here, we see it like this. Now let's say besides that, we also have an input here where we can enter some text. And let's also make sure we can actually enter something there, because right now, if I reload and add this, you'll see whenever I click in there, I also click on the list item and therefore it's removed. We can avoid this by adding a click listener here where we add the stop modifier. You learned about event modifiers before, and this stops propagation, so it makes sure that when we click on the input, the click is only processed there, and this click event on the list item is not triggered. We don't have to specify any code that should be executed if all we want to do is stop the event. So now if I reload, we can master view, click in there and type. But I didn't do that to just show you the stop modifier, even though it's good to know. Instead, let me show you a strange bug that you can experience with that. I will also add finish the course as another goal. And now I will actually type in here something, so in the first goal, and now click on it so that this goal gets deleted. And isn't that strange? Something is still there on the second goal. The first one was deleted, so the new first one is the old second one, and it kept something around. Might look like a cool feature, but it's actually a bug. This might become more obvious if I reload and try this again. Master view, finish the course, and now let's do it the other way around. Let's enter something here in the second goal and remove the first one. Now, finish the course had something in this input field a few seconds ago until we deleted the first goal. Now, the old second goal, finish the course, is the new first goal, but it lost the input which we had in this input field. And this is definitely not what you want. You could argue that this is a niche scenario, but the problem that causes this is actually a bigger one, which can also lead to performance issues if you don't fix it properly. The problem here is simple. Vue updates the list when you add and remove items. It renders the list in the real DOM and updates it as required. And it tries to do that such that it optimizes performance. That also means that it reuses DOM elements. So if we have two goals here, two DOM elements, and I delete the first one, Vue will actually not re-render the entire list. It will also not delete the first DOM element and move the second one around. Instead, it basically takes the content of the second element and moves it into the first DOM element. And that explains why, if I enter some text here, that text is lost if I delete the first element. Because the first DOM element is not actually removed. Instead, the content of the second one, and with content I mean the dynamic content, so this part with the curly braces, is moved into the old first DOM element. The input element in the first DOM element is still the old one, because the entire list item is still the old first element. Just the dynamic content was moved around. And that's why we lose the input we had on the second element when the content of the second element moves to the old first element's DOM element. I hope I could make it clear what the problem here is. Now this occurs because Vue reuses elements, which generally is good. But sometimes it needs to be able to tell elements apart. Now the problem is, since they all have the same element, the same DOM element, they are all Li elements, there is no unique identification criteria for every rendered DOM element. Yes, the content is different, but thankfully Vue is not going ahead and comparing all the content with each other. That would be super performance intensive. Instead, long story short, there is a simple extra attribute, which is a non-default HTML attribute, which you can add on elements on which you also use v-for. And that's the key attribute. The key attribute, I'm going to say it again, is not a default HTML attribute. Instead, it is an attribute understood and detected by Vue. It's optional, but it is a good idea to add it whenever you're using v-for. And actually, you will also later in the course see that there are many scenarios where you must use it. So it's already a good habit to start using it on all items where you're using v-for. And key wants a unique identification criteria for every item it's outputting here. Therefore, we want to bind it to a dynamic value with vbind, or the shorthand, just a colon. And now in here, we need something that uniquely identifies every goal. You might be inclined to say the index does that, because every goal has its own index, but, well, keep in mind that if I have two goals and I delete the first one, the old second one now has index 0. The index doesn't really belong to the goal content. The index is always the same. The first item always has index 0, for example. So the index isn't strictly attached to the element value in the array. So the index is not really a good thing to use here. Instead, in this case, we could use the goal text itself. Of course, we could enter the same goal text more than once here, but let's assume that's not the case. Then goal is good. More realistic examples would be IDs that you might, for example, already have in your database. And you will see later in the course, once we also talk to a backend and to a database, that in most cases you do have a unique ID. So getting such a unique key per list item in reality isn't too difficult. But here I'll simply use the goal text. And if I now reload and enter finish the course and master view, you will see that if I type something here in the second goal, and I then delete the first one, now the input moved together with the second one. Because now Vue was able to tell the different DOM elements apart and detect that the first DOM element now needs to be removed in order to not lose any data attached to the second element. And that was a very thorough and long explanation with a lot of behind the scenes stuff. If there's one key takeaway, again, no pun intended, it is that you should add such a key with a unique identification criteria when you're using v4. You should add it to help Vue tell the different elements apart and make sure that state, like such an entered value, is not getting lost, and also to help Vue behind the scenes do more performance optimizations. So, it's time to practice what you learned about lists and conditional content. Here's your assignment. Task number 1 is that you should add some code and a Vue app, because you currently got none, which takes the user input here, and when this add task button is pressed, the user input should be added as a task to an array of tasks. The second task for you now is to then output this list of tasks in this unordered list here. So make sure that all those task items added with the input in the button here are output here. Now the third task is that when this button here at the bottom is pressed, this task list should be hidden or shown. You should toggle between those two modes. As a bonus, also update the text on the button. As always, definitely try it on your own first, thereafter have a look at my solution video to compare your solution to mine. So, were you successful? Let's get started, and let's of course get started by creating a new app here with Vue create app, storing it in a constant, and then mounting it to the assignment ID element, so to this element here. And now to create app, we of course pass our object. Now we need to store what the user enters here and add it when the button is pressed to a list of tasks. So definitely we'll work with some data. And here we need two pieces of data. The entered value, which initially is an empty string, and then the tasks, which is an array, I would say. The entered value can be bound to this input here with vmodel, since that's a quick and easy way of, well, getting user input. And the button here, of course, needs a click event, so that we can do something when the button is clicked. And when it's clicked, of course, I want to trigger a method. So let's add methods to our Vue app. And then add a new method with a name of your choice. For example, add task. And here we want to reach out to our tasks array. And with push, we want to push this entered value as a task to this tasks array. Now we're managing a list of tasks. We just need to connect this button here by pointing at add task on its click listener. That's task number 1 solved. Task number 2 is to output this list of tasks, which we manage in the Vue app, in this unordered list. For that, we can use list items here. And I just want to emphasize that you can use v-for on any kind of element though, but typically, of course, you will use it on list items since, well, we're dealing with lists, but you're not restricted to that. Just want to make that clear. But here, a list item makes sense, and we can use v-for to go through all the tasks in tasks. So all the single task elements in our tasks list, which we have here. And task here will simply point at each individual element, and we can then use that, for example, to output it here with the double curly braces. Since task will be a simple string, since we're just pushing this string here, we can just output it like this. Just as a little side note, of course, you can also use v-for on lists that have other kinds of data than strings inside of them. But here we do have strings, and we can output it like this. And hence, if we save everything and reload, and I add my tasks here, like finish the assignment, I can click add task, and here it is. Learn Vue might be another task I have, and that all works. Now, as a little bonus, and something you might want to consider always doing, you could add such a key, as I explained. It's technically not required, and for this simple list, you won't really get a benefit by using it, but to ensure that you don't forget it in situations where it does matter, you might want to get used to always adding a key. So here we can then bind a key to task, for example, and use the task text as a unique identification criteria for every task. Of course, if we use the same task text more than once, this technically is not a good key, but we can ignore this here since it's just a dummy example. And also, just to emphasize this, you could also omit the entire key here. For this simple list, it's not needed. We also don't have any input here, which input we could lose. But still, to get used to it, I'm going to add the key here. With that, however, if I reload, it's still going to work as before. Task number 3 now is related to the conditional rendering. We want to make sure that when this button is pressed, we can hide and show the list. So for that, we'll need more data, which we manage. We'll need a data property that allows us to switch between showing and hiding the list. Something like task list is visible. The name is up to you, but this name should be pretty self-explanatory. Initially, let's say it's true. Initially, we want to show the task list on the screen. But I'll add a method, toggle task list, where I want to set this task list is visible to what it's currently not, by adding this exclamation mark here. By using this code, we ensure that if task list is visible is true, it's now set to false, and if it was false, it's now set to true. So with that, we switch between true and false on this data property. Now we can point at toggle task list on this button here by adding a click listener again with add click and pointing at toggle task list. Well, and now with that, we got this task list is visible property. So we can utilize this to show or hide this unordered list. And we can use vif or vshow here, and I'm going to go for vif since it's the more important one, but you could also argue that vshow makes more sense here since we're going to change this a lot. But again, I'll just stick to vif since it's the more common one. And I want to show this if task list is visible is true, and hide it if it's not. And since we store a boolean in there, we can just pass this as a condition like this to vif, and this will ensure that this unordered list shows up if this is true, and it does not show up if this is false. So if we save that, and I reload here, and I add one task, I can click hide and show to toggle here. And you'll see the list data is not lost in between, it's just hidden when we want to hide it. The bonus task was to also update the text on the button. And here I have two approaches. One is quick and dirty. I add double curly braces here and check task list is visible with a ternary expression. And if that's truthy, I know that the list is currently visible. So I want to show hide list on the button, because if it's visible, we want to be able to press the button to hide it. Otherwise, it's currently hidden, then the button should allow us to show it again, so the button should say show list. And if we do that, you see I can add an item, click hide list and it's gone, click show list and it's back. This is one way of doing it, the quick and dirty one, but as I also mentioned before in the course, it is a good idea to move complex logic out of the HTML code into our JavaScript code. So we can also cut this, go back to our Vue app here, and add a computed property for that. Because that's one of the scenarios where a computed property makes a lot of sense. And there we could have our button caption and return the result of checking this task list is visible and say hide list here or show list here. So simply return either that or that. And then in the HTML code, just remove this entirely and just output button caption here between the button tags, and button caption is our computed property. So now we outsource that, and therefore you see this still works, but now with a computed property. That was just a bonus, but of course it's also something you already learned about, so it is a nice extra challenge. And that's the assignment solved, and that's in general vif, vshow, and v-for. A couple of very important directives that help you with rendering conditional and list content. So that's it for this module. Another key module, which together with that module before it, forms the foundation of Vue. Now you really already know a lot, all the core basics you need to build Vue applications. And in this module, we of course learned about conditional content and lists. Conditional content is all about the vif and vshow directives, where vif is the more important one, as I mentioned. vif allows you to render content only if a certain condition is met, and with vif, the element is really added and removed to and from the DOM. With vshown, it's just shown or hidden with CSS. vif can also be combined with velse and velsif to render other elements as alternatives, only on direct sibling elements though. So velse and velsif need to be used on elements directly after vif, not inside vif, but after vif. We also learned about lists and outputting lists of data. For that, we have the v-for directive, which can be used to render multiple elements dynamically. And you learned that v-for can be used with arrays, with objects, and also with ranges, so with numbers. We also had a couple of variations there. For example, you can extract values, values and indexes, or even values, keys, and indexes if you're working with objects in v-for. And if you need v-for and vif together, as we had it in the assignment, don't use them on the same element, use a wrapper with vif instead. For example, use it on a template, a div, a UL element, or whatever makes sense in your application. Don't use them on the same element. In addition, v-for has this concept of keys that you might consider using. You need it whenever you have state in your list items, because Vue reuses DOM elements to optimize performance, but this can lead to bugs if your list item elements contain some state that should move together with the content. For that, you can use keys, and you should bind them to unique values so that Vue has a clear way of identifying every element in a unique way. Now that we spent so much time on dummy projects and all those important basics, it's time for our first, a little bit bigger project. we're going to build this Monster Slayer game in this module. It's a little game where we got various options for fighting against a monster. We got a battle log where we can see what happened, for example, how much damage we dealt. And most importantly, in this game, we'll practice all those core basics we learned about throughout the last modules and lectures. We'll practice data binding, interpolation, vbind, event binding with vOn. We'll practice how to output lists of data with v-for. We'll have conditional content with vif, like this game over screen, and so much more. It's all in there, and therefore that's the game we're now going to explore in this module to really strengthen all that core knowledge we gained over the last module, and to ensure that we're all on the same page and well prepared to venture deeper into Vue.js after this module. So let's get started. Attached to this lecture, you find this starting project, which is this index.html file with a basic skeleton for our application. No Vue logic is in there yet, it's really just HTML. You got a style CSS file with some basic styles we're going to use throughout this module, so throughout this app. And you got an empty app.js file, because we're going to write all the Vue logic together step by step. Now, as I said in the last lecture, we're going to build a simple Monster Slayer game where we have a monster health and our health. We got various options for attacking, launching a special attack, healing ourselves, or surrendering, and we want to implement all of that with Vue so that we have this browser-based game here, which we can fully control with JavaScript, but of course not with just JavaScript, but instead with Vue and JavaScript. And for that, obviously, we're going to start by controlling this with Vue. So by taking over control over some HTML code with Vue so that we can use Vue features here. And you might notice I already prepared this div with an ID game here, and well, that looks very tempting, and indeed this is the div we're going to control with Vue, because it turns out that inside of that div we got the entire game HTML code. The header is outside of the div, but the header is nothing we need to control with Vue. We're not going to use any Vue features in there. Therefore, in app.js, like we did many times before, we can create a Vue app by calling Vue create app. And we can store this in a constant and then mount our app here to this game div. So to this div with an ID game, and therefore we use the ID game selector here. So now we got a Vue app connected to this div, and now the question is, with which part do we want to start? There certainly is not just one possible route you could take. There are multiple routes, like always in programming, but I would suggest that we simply start with the attack button. So we basically implement features top to bottom. So the attack button here, when pressed, should of course reduce the monster's health, but at the same time the monster should then also strike back so that our health is also reduced. And we probably don't want to use a single hard-coded value by which we reduce healths, but we want to use some randomness so that our game isn't too predictable. And therefore in app.js, I'm going to start by managing some data. And you already saw it by now in the last lectures and modules. Data, of course, is a core concept, a core thing in Vue apps, because pretty much any app you're going to build needs some data. No matter what you're managing in there, but you're going to need some data. Think of data as the variables you need in your regular JavaScript script codes, and it makes a lot of sense that we need data. For example, here in this game, which kind of data do we need to manage here to make anything really work? Well, how about the healths of the player and the monster? We need to manage that data, we need to manage that health data because we're going to change it. And changes in the health, of course, should later be reflected back on the UI so that these health bars are reduced. So therefore we need data. We need this data option in our view app configuration object. And as you learned in this data method, which it should be, we return the object that holds our actual data. And here I, as I just explained, have two main data points, and that would be the player health. And let's say we start at a value of 100 here, though of course you can pick any values you want. And we'll need a monster health. Now we could say the monster has more or less health, but I'm also going to set the monster health to 100. So now we get these two health values, which allow us to, well, manage the health of our two game participants. But the health alone is not enough. Of course, we also need ways of changing the health, for example, when an attack is launched. So that screams for methods, because methods are essentially the actions we support in our view application. For example, when the attack button is clicked, we want to trigger a method that reduces the monster health. And therefore I'm going to name that method attack monster, because that's what we're doing. We're attacking the monster. Now, what should we do inside of this method then? What should happen inside of attack monster? Well, we want to calculate the damage we're dealing, and we then want to reduce the monster health by that damage. And as I said before, I want to use a random value here. You could, of course, always deduct the same amount from the monster health, but your game would be pretty predictable then. So to calculate a random value, we can use the mathRandom function, which gives us a random number between 0 and 1. Now, I don't want a value between 0 and 1. Instead, since we're working with a health of 100, we probably want a higher number. So for example, we could say that we want to get a random number between a minimum and a maximum value. Let's say between 5 and 12. We want to deal at least 5 points of damage, but no more than 12 points of damage. And the formula for calculating this is to multiply mathRandom with the difference of max, which is 12 as I just explained, minus the min value, which should be 5, for example. And then we take the floor of that to round it down so that we don't have a number with a decimal place, but we have an integer number instead, and we add the minimum again. This is a formula for calculating a random number between 5 and 12. So this will give me my attack value, let's say, by which I want to reduce the monster health. So therefore, here, I want to reach out to this monster health, and I explained that we can access all data properties in your methods through the this keyword, because view will merge all your data properties in this object into a global behind the scenes managed object, and that's why we can use this here in a method and get access to this monster health. And we want access to monster health so that we can set monster health equal to this monster health minus the attack value we just derived. We can also write this in a bit of a shorter way. We can use a JavaScript shortcut here, a shorthand notation, and use minus equal attack value. That's exactly doing the same thing. With that, we're reducing the monster health by the attack value we derived here. Now, that's one part of the equation. We want to be able to attack the monster. But of course, the monster should also be able to attack us as a player. And let's say whenever we attacked the monster, as a consequence thereafter, the monster should attack back. So we can add a second method, a second action to our game, so to say, which is attack player. So that is the monster attacking us as a player. And here we want to do essentially the same. We want to get an attack value calculated randomly But let's say the monster actually hits a bit harder, so the max damage is 15, and the min damage, let's say, is 8 instead of 5, so that by just spamming attack all the time, we probably won't win because the monster hits us harder. And then we take this calculated attack value and deduct it from the player health. Like this. Now, since I have the same formula for calculating a random number, I will actually outsource this into a separate function. And here I'll use a regular JavaScript function and not a view method, because this will be a function which I only call from inside my JavaScript code, which will not use any view-controlled data properties or anything like that, and which will not be called from inside our template, so from inside our HTML code. And if all of that is the case, if you don't need access to view-controlled properties, if you're not calling the function from inside HTML, and you only use it from inside the JavaScript code, then you can write a regular JavaScript function, and I'll name it getRandomValue, and I want to get a min and a max boundary here, and then just grab that formula, cut it, and return it here, and replace 12 with max and 5 with min. And the advantage of this is that we can now simply call getRandomValue here and pass in 5 and 12, and do the same down there and pass in 8 and 15. And with that we save some code and we simply outsource this into a separate function. Okay. So with that, we got our two actions. One thing is missing here in those methods, and then of course we also need to connect this to the HTML code. But the missing thing here, of course, is that attack player should be triggered whenever we attacked the monster. So here, after attack monster, I'll reach out to attack player and call this method here. And that's something we haven't done thus far in the previous modules. But just as we can access data properties through the this keyword, we can also access methods through the this keyword inside of the view instance config object here. And the reason for that is the same as with the data properties. I mentioned that this data would be merged into a behind-the-scenes managed global object, and it's the same for methods and for computed properties. All of that is getting merged into that behind-the-scenes controlled global object. And therefore, just as we can access data properties through the this keyword inside of methods, we can also access other methods in there and call them. So we can call attack player here from inside attack monster to make sure that this method executes right after this method executed. And with that, we're done with the JavaScript code for now, but of course we also need to connect this to our HTML content now. We need to make sure that in our HTML code, we now also trigger attack monster when the attack button is clicked, and that we update those health bars. So let's work on that next. Of course, feel free to try this on your own first, before we then continue together in the next lecture. So let's do this together now. Let's make sure attack monster is triggered when the attack button is clicked. And for that, of course, we need to go to the index.html file. Here we have the attack button, and we simply want to add a click listener to it. We can do this with v-on-click, or as you learned, we can use the shorthand with just @click. And that's the style I'm going to use throughout the course, so I'm using it here as well. Now here, as a value, we want to make sure that attack monster gets executed, and therefore we can call attack monster like this, or as you learned, alternatively, we just point at it, we just provide the name of the to be executed function to view here, and view will execute attack monster for us when a click occurs. Both is supported by view. I'm going to use this point at the function approach. So now attack monster should be executed when we click the attack button. But in order to see something, I also want to make sure that those health bars are updated when the player and monster healths change. And how could we now achieve this? Well, this div here, these two divs, the health bar value divs, in the end, these are the divs that control by how much the health bars are filled. So if we change their width, we'll reduce the health bar on the screen. And here I will actually use inline styles with the style attribute to set that width and override any width set through a class. This is one of the scenarios where such an inline style approach makes sense, because we want to be able to set the width to any value, so predefining CSS classes with all possible widths we might need is pretty cumbersome and almost impossible. Therefore here, I want to set the inline style, but of course I want to set it dynamically. And we can do this with vbind or just the shorthand of :style. And then you learned that you can pass an object here to your style binding. And in that object, you can define which CSS property you want to change and then give that property a potentially dynamic value. And here I want to change the width property of this div and set it to a value which indeed will be dynamic. I want to set it basically to my player or to my monster health, depending on which health bar I'm working on. Here, this is the first health bar, which is the monster's health bar. So here, I want to use the monster health. So this data property. And as you learned throughout the last lectures and modules, here in your HTML code, in the template of your Vue app, so to say, it's not this monster health, it's not data monster health, it's just monster health. You have direct access to all your data properties and to all your methods without using this or anything like that. Now, the monster health will be a value between 0 and 100, at least once we're done. At the moment, it could also become negative, but we'll prevent this soon. But it will definitely be not higher than 100. And that's pretty good. That means we can use a percentage width here, where initially it's 100% and it can go down to 0%. So in the end, we set this to monster health plus percentage sign as a string, because width is a CSS property and it wants a value like 10 pixels, 1 rem, or 50% or anything like that. So you need to add a unit. Hence, the number alone is not enough. Instead, we combine the number with a string to turn it overall in a string, which is what width wants here if we set it through JavaScript. And that string contains the unit of this value, so that we set this to 100%, to 80%, and so on. And of course, we don't just want to do that here on the monster health, but also here on the second div on the player health bar. But of course, here we therefore refer to player health. And now if we save all files and reload here, if we press attack, you see the health bars become lower and lower. They are reduced, and that proves that both our data as well as methods logic here works, and that our dynamic style bindings also work. Now, there's one thing I want to improve. It's optional, but something I would recommend. As I also mentioned already a couple of times throughout this course, you shouldn't put too much logic into your HTML code. You want to keep that HTML code relatively lean. And therefore, I will actually cut this here and add computed properties. As a side note, this is a nice practice. So here I'll add computed properties with the computed option in our Vue instance config object next to data and methods, though the exact position does not matter. You could add it after methods or before it, doesn't matter. And in here, I'll have my monster bar styles, where I want to return this object I just cut. But here, of course, we should now use this monster health, since we're now having code inside of our Vue instance object. And we'll need player bar styles, where I want to return this object here, which I had on the player health bar. So return this here, this JavaScript object. Of course, reference this player health here, as just explained. And now we can use these two computed properties here to set our styles dynamically. So here it's the monster bar styles, and down there on the second bar, it's the player bar styles. Now let me reformat that and save that. And if I reload, it still works, but now we got the logic out of the HTML code, and we're also using computed properties. So that is our first important step. The attack function works. Now let's make sure the special attack function also works. Now that the attack button and the attack action is working, let's implement the next action we want to support in this game. And that is the special attack action, and therefore the special attack button that should work. The idea here is relatively simple. I want to do the same as in attack monster, but we should deal more damage. On the other hand, and to not make this too powerful, the special attack should therefore not be available all the time, but only every 3 rounds. So let's start by adding this method though. I'll name it special attack monster. And in here, I want to calculate an attack value, but let's say between 10 and 25 damage points. So we have the potential to do quite a lot of damage. Of course, just as before, we then reach out to the monster health and deduct the attack value from it. And also just as before, the monster should still attack us back thereafter. It does not just attack back if we launched a normal attack, it also attacks back if we use a special attack. So here we call attack player thereafter to make sure that we as a player are attacked after we launched a special attack. Now, with that, we can connect this special attack button here, again by adding a click listener, and then by pointing at the special attack monster method we just added. And if we save that and save the JavaScript file and reload, if I click special attack, I'm doing a lot of damage to the monster, as you can tell by its quickly shrinking monster health bar. But the problem is that right now we can spam this attack. So winning would not be too hard because we can press the same button over and over again. And therefore I want to restrict this powerful attack. It should only be available every 3 rounds. And when it's not available, this button therefore should be disabled. So how could we implement that? How could we make sure that this is the way it works? Well, we could keep track of the number of rounds the game is already lasting. For that, we can add a new data property because we got a new piece of data we want to change and update and be aware of. And I'll name this current round. I'll add it here to the data property and not add it as a regular JavaScript variable, for example, because we'll need access to it from inside the Vue instance, and Vue needs to be aware of when it changes. And that is all the case if something is a data property in the Vue app. So now we got the current round, we start at 0, and I want to increment that round, of course, whenever we do anything. So whenever we attack and so on. Whenever that happens, the round should change. So therefore, for example, when we attack the monster, I'll set this current round ++ to increment it by 1. When the monster attacks us, I'll not do it because that will still be the same round, right? The monster attacks us whenever we did something, so we don't need to change the round again when that happens. But we need to change it when we launch a special attack, of course. So now we got this current round. How can we now use it to control the special attack button? Well, we can go back to index.html and disable the button if the current round is not divisible by 3. That makes sure that we can only use it every 3 rounds. To achieve this, we can set the disabled attribute of a button, but of course not like that, but instead to a dynamic value, and we can do that on attributes as you learned with vbind, or again, this shorthand of just : disabled. And I want to set this to true or false. And true or false should be derived based on the current round. So here we can access current round. So this current round data property we added. And use the modulus operator, which we have in JavaScript, to divide it by 3 and find out what the remainder of this division is. And we know if the remainder is not 0, then this was not divisible by 3, and therefore we know we're certainly not in the 3rd or 6th or 9th round. And we only want to enable the button in those rounds. So we'll disable it if the division of 3 does not leave a remainder of 0. If we saved it and reload, the special attack is available, but once I clicked it, you see it's become gray. And now I need to do 2 more normal attacks before it's enabled again. So this is now working the way it should. But as so often, I don't necessarily want to have that logic in my HTML code, and therefore I'll cut it here, go back to app.js, and add a new computed property, which we could name may use special attack. And in here we simply return this calculation, now using the this keyword though, since we're in the view instance. And with that we can use the may use special attack computed property here, just like that, to make sure that the button is disabled when it should be disabled. So that's working now, and with that we ensure that we only have access to the special attack every 3 rounds. And that's the special attack functionality implemented. So we can attack, we can launch a special attack every 3 rounds, and we're already using some nice view features that make building such a game very, very easy. Now let's move on to the next button, to the heal button. Maybe we as a player took too much damage and we want to heal ourselves. So we should implement a functionality for that as well. So in the methods of my Vue app, I'm going to add a heal player method, because the heal functionality, the heal button, of course should heal the player, not the monster. For that, I'll calculate a heal value, and we can use the same getRandomValue function to get a random value between 2 boundaries. And it's up to you which values you want to use here. Since the monster hits us between 8 and 15, I want to get a heal value of, let's say, 8 and 20. So between 8 and 20. And now, of course, we'll just reach out to the player health and simply add that calculated heal value. But we should be careful here. Always adding this heal value like this would introduce a bug in our game, because we could heal ourselves above 100 health. We start with 100 health and we shouldn't be able to heal ourselves for more than that. So to prevent that this happens, we can add an if check here in heal player and check if our player health plus the calculated heal value would exceed 100. And if that's the case, if we would heal ourselves above 100, then I instead want to set the player health to 100, so that we can't go higher than that. And only in the else case, if our current health plus the calculated heal value does not exceed 100, only then I want to add the full heal value to the player health, simply to ensure that we can't go above 100. So with that, we got the heal player method. Now we can connect it to the button by adding a click listener, as we did many times before, and by calling heal player, just like that. And if we now save that and reload, if I press heal initially, nothing happens, but if I launch a special attack, this works, I can attack, and now let's heal ourselves, that worked, heal ourselves, that worked, so that's looking good. But we're not fully done. For one, healing ourselves should also count as a round in the game. So of course, here, I also want to increment the current round. In addition, the monster should attack us thereafter, because just because we heal ourselves does not mean that the monster does nothing. So once we're done healing ourselves, the monster will attack the player, and we do that by calling the attack player function. And now with that, if I reload, you see if I heal myself initially, my health still goes down, because healing myself initially makes no sense. I already have a health of 100, so we heal by nothing, but the monster attacks us thereafter, and hence we take damage. But of course we can still heal ourselves thereafter, and eventually, well, try to win that game. Yeah, like that. So that should work, but of course we're still not done, with the game at least, because we now have all those actions here, and the health bars change appropriately. But how does the game end? We want to ensure that either the monster or the player wins, or for the unlikely scenario that we both go below 0 health, that we have a draw. And that could happen, by the way. Since we attack and the monster always attacks back, we could launch an attack that takes the monster below 0, and then with its last blow, the monster also takes us below 0 health. So a draw would be possible. Well, let's work on those win and lose conditions next. Of course, feel free to try implementing this on your own first, before we then implement it together, because that, of course, is a great practice.